There is a room somewhere in Washington right now where someone is staring at a map of North American pipelines and realizing that the strategy was built on an assumption that turned out to be wrong. The assumption was simple. Canada needed America more than America needed Canada. And nowhere was that assumption felt more confidently than in the energy sector. Because for decades, the story of Canadian energy was the story of one customer, one direction, and one dependency that Washington believed it could always exploit. Canada sent its oil south. Canada sent its natural gas south. Canada sent its electricity south. And in return, Canada asked for nothing except continued access to the only market it had ever really known. That was the energy trap. Not a trap set by Washington, not a conspiracy, not a deliberate act of malice, just a structural reality that had calcified over 60 years of infrastructure built in one direction, refineries engineered to process one type of crude, and a political assumption on both sides of the border that the arrangement was permanent enough to threaten, permanent enough to use as leverage, permanent enough to assume that when the pressure came, Canada would fold. And then, on May 1st, 2026, in an interview with the Canadian press to mark 1 year since his electoral victory, Prime Minister Mark Carney said 4 words that traveled from a government office on Parliament Hill in Ottawa to every energy desk, every trade ministry, and every geopolitical analysis unit in the developed world within hours of being published. 4 words that were not a threat, not a declaration, not a dramatic press conference announcement. Just a quiet, precise answer to a question about whether Canada would use its energy and critical minerals as leverage in the upcoming COSMA renegotiation. He said, "We have other options. Subscribe now, because what those 4 words mean, what infrastructure made them credible, what 60 years of dependency looks like when it starts to unwind, and why Washington went quiet after hearing them, is one of the most important energy stories of the decade." And it is happening right now, in real time, 6 weeks before the most consequential trade deadline North America has faced in a generation. To understand what Carney actually said, you have to understand the full context. Because the 4 words were not isolated, they were embedded in a statement that was far more strategically precise than it appeared on the surface. The United States Trade Representative, Jameson Greer, had just told a group of visiting Canadian politicians and trade officials in Washington that Canada should not attempt to use its energy and natural resources as leverage in the CUSMA negotiations. He said the administration wanted to work with Canada on energy and critical minerals development in ways that would benefit both countries. Natural Resources Minister Tim Hodgson had already publicly called energy and resources Canada's strongest cards in the CUSMA renegotiation. So the question was already hanging in the air when Carney sat down for his interview. And his answer did something that most political leaders in his position would not have done. He did not say, "Yes, we will use it as leverage." That would have been aggressive and would have given Washington exactly the confrontation it wanted to manage. He did not say, "No, we would never do that." That would have been a concession before negotiations even began, surrendering the most valuable card without getting anything in return. Instead, he reframed the entire concept. He said he rejected the characterization that energy was leverage at all. He called it trade. And then he asked a question that no one in Washington had a good answer to. He said, should we be further integrating our energy markets with the United States at a time they view that as leverage? And then, almost as an afterthought, delivered in the same measured tone he uses for everything, he said, if it's not in our mutual interest to trade more, we have other options. 4 words. And Washington had no immediate answer, because the answer required admitting something that the entire American posture in this trade war had been built on not admitting, that the energy trap was not actually a trap anymore. And that the infrastructure which made it possible to say those 4 words credibly had been quietly and methodically built over the previous 2 years, while Washington was focused on tariffs and trade ultimatums and political theater. Let us go back to the beginning of what those 4 words rest on. Because you cannot understand the weight of "we have other options" without understanding what the alternative used to be. For most of Canada's energy history, the country had almost exactly one option: the United States. The numbers were stark enough to be almost embarrassing. In 2024, Canada exported $169.8 billion worth of hydrocarbons to the United States, according to the Montreal Economic Institute. That included crude oil, natural gas liquids, and refined petroleum products. That single figure accounted for 22% of all Canadian goods exports. The United States was not just Canada's largest energy customer. It was essentially Canada's only energy customer, because the entire physical infrastructure of Canadian energy export, the pipelines, the transmission lines, the pricing mechanisms, had all been built facing south. Consider the specificity of that dependency. Canada supplies approximately 70% of American crude oil imports, representing a daily flow of nearly 4 million barrels. American refineries, particularly in the Midwest and Gulf Coast, have invested billions in specialized equipment designed specifically to process Canada's heavier crude oil grades, the bitumen extracted from Alberta's oil sands. These refineries cannot simply switch to lighter crude alternatives without significant capital expenditure and operational downtime. Canada provides 99.7% of all American natural gas imports, according to the U.S. Energy Information Administration data from 2025. 60 to 70 oil and gas pipelines and more than 35 transmission lines run across the shared border. Canada's hydroelectric grid supplies electricity to multiple American states. Canada provides 34 critical minerals and metals that the Pentagon itself has identified as essential to national security. That infrastructure created the dependency. But here is what Washington missed in its strategic calculation. A dependency that flows in both directions simultaneously is not leverage. It is interdependence. And interdependence is not a weapon that one side can deploy against the other without injuring itself. The question that Carney's forewords forced Washington to confront was not whether Canada needed American markets. It clearly did. The question was whether America had created alternatives to Canadian energy supply. And the answer, as of May 2026, was demonstrably no. American shale oil cannot replace Canadian heavy crude in the refineries built to process it. American domestic natural gas production, despite being the world's largest, cannot replace the pipeline gas that flows north to south without new infrastructure that takes years to build and billions to finance. The electricity grid interconnections are not reversible on a political timeline. So when Washington told Canada that its energy was leverage, what it was actually saying was that Canada should be grateful for a dependency that America had also built into its own industrial base, and should not consider the possibility that other customers might want the same product. That was the miscalculation. And the Trans Mountain Pipeline exposed it. The Trans Mountain expansion project came online in May 2024, tripling the pipeline's capacity from 300,000 barrels per day to 890,000 barrels per day. For the first time in Canadian energy history, landlocked Alberta crude had direct access to Pacific tidewater. Within its first month of operation, the combined pipeline system was already transporting 704,000 barrels per day. And within the first 12 months of operation, something happened that no one in Washington had fully priced into their strategic assumptions. China overtook the United States as the top oil purchaser from the Trans Mountain Pipeline. The numbers from Statistics Canada were unambiguous. Between May 2024 and April 2025, crude oil exports through British Columbia surged by more than six-fold compared to the previous year. Within that seaborne export volume, the United States accounted for 51.9%. China accounted for 31.9%. Hong Kong at 7.1%. Singapore at 6.3%. South Korea at 1.6%. India at 1.2%. By October 2025, according to Bloomberg data cited by Vortexa Analytics, as much as 70% of oil cargoes departing British Columbia were bound for Chinese ports. Average crude oil shipments to China through the pipeline had reached about 207,000 barrels per day, surpassing the 173,000 barrels per day going to the United States during the same period. In April 2026, Canada exported more seaborne crude oil to China than to the United States for the first time in history, according to Reuters. That milestone was not an accident. It was not a temporary market fluctuation. It was the beginning of a structural realignment that the Trans Mountain Pipeline had made physically possible, and that American tariffs had made economically rational. Because here is the part of the story that Washington was not fully accounting for in its leverage calculations. When American tariffs raised costs for Canadian exporters and created uncertainty about the future of American market access, Canadian producers did not simply absorb the pain and wait for the political weather to change. They shipped their oil to whoever was willing to pay a fair price without political conditions attached. Trans Mountain's pipeline currently operates at roughly 84% of its 890,000 barrel per day capacity. Trans Mountain Corp is already reviewing expansion projects that could add between 200,000 and 300,000 additional barrels per day of capacity, with the majority of that additional volume expected to go to Asia rather than the United States. Terminal dredging at the Westridge Marine Terminal, due for completion in late 2026 or early 2027, will allow larger oil tankers to load 700,000 to 750,000 barrels per vessel, improving the economics of Pacific exports further. And that was just the oil story. Because while oil was the most visible piece of the energy trap being dismantled, the natural gas story was simultaneously rewriting a different chapter of the same narrative. On June 30th, 2025, the LNG tanker Gaslog Glasgow pulled out of the port of Kitimat in British Columbia and headed across the Pacific. It was carrying the first cargo of liquefied natural gas ever exported from a large-scale Canadian LNG facility. The destination was Incheon, South Korea. The facility behind that cargo, LNG Canada, represented the largest private sector investment in Canadian history at 40 billion Canadian dollars. Its partners were Shell at 40%, Petronas at 25%, PetroChina at 15%, Mitsubishi at 15%, and Korea Gas at 5%. By November 2025, the facility had completed its second train and shipped its 50th cargo, ramping toward Phase 1 capacity of 14 million tons of LNG per year. For decades, Canada had enormous reserves of natural gas, but virtually no ability to export them to anyone except the United States. The American market absorbed essentially all of it through pipelines that pointed south. LNG Canada changed that equation permanently. For the first time, Canadian natural gas could be liquefied and loaded onto a ship and sent to South Korea, Japan, China, or any buyer in Asia with the economic incentive and the physical infrastructure to receive it. Canada's Pacific coast is significantly closer to Asian markets than American Gulf Coast LNG facilities. Shipping times from Kitimat to Asia are estimated at 17 to 18 days, shorter than competing routes from the Gulf of Mexico. Phase 2 of LNG Canada would double the facility's output to 28 million tons annually. The Case Ileasum's LNG project, another Pacific Coast facility now approaching its final investment decision in 2026, would add further capacity. Woodfibre LNG and Cedar LNG are expected to be completed between 2027 and 2028. When you add up the infrastructure, either already operational or under active development, you begin to see what we have other options actually means in physical terms. It does not mean that Canada will stop trading energy with the United States tomorrow. It means that Canada is actively building the capacity to redirect significant volumes of its energy supply to other buyers, that the infrastructure to do so is already partially operational, and that every month the tariffs remain in place, more of that capacity gets utilized. That is what paralyzed Washington. Not the threat of an energy cutoff, which Carney explicitly ruled out, saying Canada honors its contracts and agreements and is not talking about halting any trade. The paralysis came from something more uncomfortable. The realization that the dependency which had underpinned the entire American negotiating posture was not a permanent condition. It was a historical artifact that was actively being dismantled by physical infrastructure, signed contracts, and new buyers who did not attach political conditions to their purchases. And then there were the critical minerals, because if the oil and gas story was the visible surface of the energy trap being dismantled, the critical mineral story was the part that ran deeper and touched the most sensitive nerve in Washington's strategic planning. Canada possesses 34 of the minerals and metals that the Pentagon has identified as essential to national security. This includes lithium, cobalt, nickel, rare earth elements, uranium, and tungsten. The United States defense industrial base depends on these materials for everything from fighter jet components to armor-piercing ammunition to advanced electronics to the battery systems that power military vehicles and communications equipment. Canada had exported $169.8 billion in energy products to the United States in 2024. But the critical minerals story was not primarily about the current dollar value of trade. It was about what the trade represented in terms of supply chain security. When Carney asked whether further integration of energy markets was appropriate at a time when Washington viewed that integration as leverage, he was raising the same question about critical minerals. If the United States believes it can use its size and economic weight to extract concessions from Canada by threatening the trade relationship, then Canada has every rational reason to ask whether deepening that relationship is in Canada's long-term interest. And if the answer is that it might not be, then developing alternative buyers, alternative contracts, and alternative supply chains for those critical minerals is not a hostile act. It is rational economic governance. The federal government's new defense strategy, anchored in the $81.8 billion defense investment announced in Budget 2025, explicitly highlighted critical minerals as central to Canada's own defense and supply chain security. Canada was simultaneously signing agreements with the European Union to gain preferential access to military equipment, cooperating with European defense firms under a framework signed in 2025, and advancing the new West Coast oil pipeline, now in advanced planning, that would carry approximately 1 million barrels per day of Alberta crude to the port of Prince Rupert, from which it could be loaded onto very large crude carriers for delivery to Asian markets. Alberta expected to submit that project to Canada's Federal Major Projects Office for designation as a project of national interest by July 2026. Prime Minister Carney had already signaled strong federal support. Now add to all of this the context of the Strait of Hormuz crisis of March 2026. On March 1st, 2026, nearly 150 oil and LNG tankers sat anchored outside the Strait of Hormuz, engines running, cargo stranded, insurance markets collapsing. Major shippers halted transits. Brent crude surged 10% overnight. Iran broadcast warnings over radio. The world's most important energy choke point, carrying roughly 20% of global seaborne oil and LNG, was paralyzed. China imports roughly 3/4 of its crude oil. Japan and South Korea import more than 90% of their crude oil. Nearly half of India's crude oil imports and approximately 60% of its natural gas pass through the Strait of Hormuz. That crisis did something for Canada's energy position that no amount of diplomatic negotiation or political positioning could have achieved. It made Canada's stable, politically secure Pacific Access energy supply more attractive to Asian buyers in a single week than years of trade promotion had accomplished. Analysts at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada had already argued in March 2026 that the infrastructure being built on Canada's Pacific coast would define Asian energy security for decades, and that decisions made in 2026 and 2027 would lock in supply patterns until the 2070s. Against that backdrop, Canadian LNG from Kitimat was not competing against American Gulf Coast LNG for Asian market share. It was offering Asian buyers something structurally different: a politically stable supplier with shorter shipping routes, lower carbon intensity per ton of LNG produced, and no geopolitical drama attached to the commercial relationship. When Carney said we have other options, every energy ministry in Asia that had been watching the Hormuz crisis, every long-term procurement officer at a Japanese utility or a South Korean petrochemical company, every Chinese refinery operator who had been buying Trans Mountain crude for the previous 18 months understood exactly what those 4 words meant. They meant that if Washington continued to treat Canadian energy as a political instrument rather than a commercial relationship, other buyers would receive the long-term contracts, the infrastructure investment commitments, and the preferential supply relationships that the United States had historically assumed were automatically reserved for American customers. That is the energy trap explained, not the trap that Washington thought it was setting for Canada. The trap that Washington built for itself, over 60 years of infrastructure investment that created a dependency so deep and so institutionally embedded that the people running American trade policy had stopped noticing it was a dependency at all. And then a pipeline opened to the Pacific. A LNG terminal shipped its first cargo to South Korea, and a prime minister sat down for an interview and said 4 words that expressed in the most concise possible form what that infrastructure actually meant. We have other options. Carney was careful to frame this not as aggression, but as a question of mutual interest. He said the correct question was not whether energy was leverage, but whether further integration of energy markets with the United States was actually in Canada's interest when Washington treated that integration as a tool for extracting concessions. That is a qualitatively different question from anything that had been asked publicly in the bilateral relationship before, because it implies something that Washington had not fully confronted: that the energy dependency flows in both directions, that Canada has been actively building the infrastructure to make it flow differently, and that the rational response to being told your most important resource is leverage against you is to build alternatives until it isn't. The TD Bank analysis that Carney's own government had been citing made the underlying mathematics plain. Remove Canadian energy exports from the equation, TD economists noted, and the trade story flips completely. Without energy, the United States actually runs a trade surplus with Canada of around 60 billion Canadian dollars. The enormous American trade deficit that Trump had been citing as evidence of unfair treatment was almost entirely an energy accounting artifact. And the energy was flowing south because Canada had built the infrastructure to send it south, and because American refineries had been built to receive it, and because the arrangement had been commercially rational for both sides for 60 years. Not because Canada was doing America a favor, and not because America had the right to assume the arrangement was permanent. The CUSMA review deadline of July 1st, 2026 is now less than 2 months away. The mandatory joint review requires all 3 countries to either endorse renewal or signal an intention to exit. Trade Representative Greer has already said the United States is unlikely to rubber stamp the deal, suggesting longer negotiations are in store. CBC and other Canadian outlets reported in late April 2026 that the Trump administration was demanding what sources described as an entry fee before formal negotiations could begin, including changes to Canadian supply management, procurement policies, digital regulation, and alignment of external tariffs that would directly conflict with Canada's recent trade agreements with China and other markets. Carney's government had been explicit in response. Canada has no intention of making concessions before a broader negotiation. The Canada-U.S. Economic Advisory Council met for the first time in late April 2026 and made that position clear. And embedded in that position, backing it up, giving it the weight that distinguishes a principled stance from an empty gesture, was the infrastructure. The pipeline flowing oil to China, the LNG terminal shipping gas to South Korea, the new pipeline in planning that would expand Pacific access further, the Trans Mountain expansion running at 84% of its new capacity and reviewing projects to expand further, the LNG Canada Phase 2 expansion under engineering study, the new West Coast Pipeline project approaching federal designation as a project of national interest. We have other options, forwards. And behind them, 890,000 barrels per day of Pacific pipeline capacity running at 84% utilization and growing. 14 million tons per year of LNG export capacity with a Phase 2 expansion under study that would double it. 60% of seaborne trans-mountain crude already bound for Asian markets. Canada's first monthly export of more seaborne crude oil to China than to the United States in April 2026. A new West Coast oil pipeline expected to submit for national interest designation in July 2026 that would add another million barrels per day of Pacific access. And behind all of that infrastructure, a government with a majority mandate running until 2029, a prime minister who had governed 2 central banks and designed global financial stability architecture, and 91% of Canadians who told pollsters they wanted to reduce their country's reliance on the United States. The energy trap that Washington had relied on for 60 years was not designed to be a trap. It was designed to be a partnership. And when one partner began treating the relationship as a tool for extracting concessions rather than a mutually beneficial commercial arrangement built over generations, the other partner did what rational economic actors do when they face a concentrated dependency. They built alternatives, slowly, expensively, with enormous infrastructure investment and long-term commitment. And then, when the moment was right, they sat down for an interview and said, quietly, in the same tone one uses to state a fact that everyone in the room already knows, we have other options. The question that Washington has not yet publicly answered is the same question that Carney's 4 words actually asked. Is further integration of North American energy markets in Canada's interest at a time when Washington views that integration as leverage? Because if the answer is no, and if Canada continues building the Pacific infrastructure at the pace it is currently building, then the energy map of North America in 2035 will look fundamentally different from the energy map of 2024. And the moment at which that becomes irreversible may already have passed. So here's the question I want you to sit with, because this is where the story gets genuinely uncertain in ways that matter for the next decade. If Canada completes the new West Coast oil pipeline, expands LNG Canada to Phase 2 capacity, and locks in long-term contracts with Asian buyers over the next 3 years, does Washington still have the energy leverage that its entire negotiating posture in this trade war was built on? And if the answer is no, what does that mean for the price every American household pays for energy, for the cost every American refinery pays for the crude oil it processes, and for the strategic security of the defense industrial base that depends on Canadian critical minerals? Because the energy trap, it turns out, was set by geography and built by infrastructure investment and maintained by an assumption that the existing arrangement was too embedded to change. And the 4 words spoken on May 1st, 2026, on Parliament Hill in Ottawa were not the beginning of that change. They were confirmation that the change was already underway, already measured in millions of barrels and millions of tons and billions of dollars in signed contracts, and already too far along to be reversed by a tariff or a threat or a trade representative's warning that Canada should not use its energy as leverage. We have other options, 4 words, and the pipeline to prove it. Make sure you are subscribed, because the next chapter of this story, the CUSMA deadline on July 1st, the new West Coast pipeline decision expected the same month, and what happens when Washington has to respond to an energy map that no longer points exclusively south, is the one that will define the shape of North American trade for the next generation.